lots of researchers have these like turning points in their careers. And for me, it was like, oh, like we really weren't thinking about our participants as like benefiting versus just getting compensation because we were so naive. I think at some point I was like, Odila, what if we return the money? Because I don't feel comfortable. So basically, the project, it became participant facing because I was like, well, what do we do? You know, like we can return the money. And she was like, maybe, but also she's like, I think it's still an important thing. And I was like, okay, yeah. And we had a really cool team of consultants. So we were like, we need to pivot.
Hi, welcome to the Karakter Podcast. My name is Andre Ardona. I'm a fourth-year University of Toronto Mississauga student. I'm double majoring in psychology and sociology. I'm making this podcast as a part of a UTM course called Knowledge Translation. In this class, students seek to clearly and effectively communicate discoveries from UTM's psychology department. This is the second installment of a two-part series where I speak with Professor Joanne Chung. Dr. Chung worked with Dr. Odelia Lacalia of Utrecht University on the Karakter Project as the study's principal investigators. Quoting from the study's website, the Karakter Project is a developmental research study focused on the emotions and character growth of Syrian-origin young adults who had recently resettled in the Netherlands. In this episode, Dr. Chung and I discuss what it means to enrich the research process. We talk about the feedback participants of the Karakter Project had for the study. We also identify open science principles essential in psychological study. Dr. Chung makes a myriad of recommendations for researchers on how to implement these ideas into their work. If you want to learn about what the Karakter Project is and its findings, I invite you to listen to the first part of this podcast. Thank you for coming. So, moving to the Netherlands was a really hard process. When you were collecting the data, I think an important thing, like you mentioned, is to take like a kind of like a person-centered approach in a way. There's a phrase, enriching the research process.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on what that meant for your study?
You're bringing up a personality approach called like the person-centered approach. It's usually methodological, but it also has like conceptual reasons why we would do it that way. And you're relating it to being participant-facing, and that's exactly like, I think that's was a connection for me because I was like, yeah, we're not just collecting data from participants. How can we actually make their experience like cool for them versus like extracting data? I think that would be good. And I do want to be really honest about how this came about. So whenever you're like pitching a research study, you have to go through a ethics board. And we went through something called the medical ethics board because we had a vulnerable population. And a vulnerable population is just, I guess, like an analogous population in terms of like what the ethics board thinks is vulnerable here in Canada is probably like Indigenous people. So it's like they want to make sure that the costs do not outweigh the benefits of doing the work. I think I've mentioned that we were pretty naive, pretty young researchers. And so we went in and we wrote a protocol based on like our previous experience of just analyzing other people's data and maybe other people's research studies that were not focused on vulnerable populations or people from minoritized groups. And the medical ethics committee was like, we don't know if this should actually happen. And I remember like my first reaction was like, how dare they? Like, they have no idea. Why are they trying to like block us from doing research? We have funding. And then when I read their comments and thought about it, what I always try to do is I try to see the other side. And then I realized, and I was like, this is really true that like we're coming in as outsiders. And like this ethics board has probably seen so many not so great research proposals. I just want to say like ideas are just kind of like everybody has ideas and everybody has the same idea.
Yep.
So like at the time that me and Odelia were like, oh, like we should like do something like real life, real world applicable or whatever. Everybody was doing that too. I mean, not everybody, but like there were just more than one of us. I'm sure the ethics board had reasons. And when I really started to reflect, because I feel like lots of researchers have these like turning points in their careers. And for me, it was like, oh, like we really weren't thinking about our participants as like benefiting versus just getting compensation because we were so naive. I think at some point I was like, Odila, what if we return the money? Because I don't feel comfortable. So basically, the project, it became participant facing because I was like, well, what do we do? You know, like we can return the money. And she was like, maybe, but also she's like, I think it's still an important thing. And I was like, okay, yeah. And we had a really cool team of consultants. So we were like, we need to pivot. So we looked for research assistants that were of like Syrian heritage, that actually had that experience, that were interested in getting research experience, but also steering the project in a way that they would see as like a positive, or like maybe positive is like, no, I think we wanted to make it a positive experience because we're asking a lot of our participants, right? We're asking them to share like potentially really painful memories, to tell us about their lives. How do we make it beneficial for them? And so we met these two really great research assistants. And then we had 3 research assistants that were of Syrian background. And then we had 4. And then like everything kind of changed. We just, like you know how I said I started off in cross-cultural psychology, all
Yeah.
that methods background, that started to come into play. That was like my first foray into kind of being more participant facing and thinking about, are there actual real ways that participants can benefit from being in this research besides getting compensation? And I just want to say too, the compensation in the Netherlands for research participants is quite low because at least with the institution we were working with, they were like, we really don't want people to feel coerced. So the money is going to be very, very low. And so how do we make it enriching? And so we came up with these ideas in collaboration with the RAs that I'm talking about. And I just have to give them a shout out, like Huda, Zaina, Kenan, Rima, like amazing folks that like were really generous with their lived experience, their expertise. And they were like, well, you know, what if we do like events for them? What if we do like a seminar series on psychology? What if we make a book of their art? And I was like, that's all really awesome. And so we started to go that way, and then just keeping them updated with newsletters and kind of tokens of appreciation, like, you know, like grocery totes or like water bottles, a journal at the end.
Yeah, and it's really amazing because when I think about like psychology research, not a jab at anybody else or anything, but when we talk about compensation, a lot of the time it's just like a gift card or course credit. And of course, it'd be different for different experiences and different things you're studying. But I think this was something that was really unique for your paper and your research because it's really enriching for the research process, to go back to that quote. And I'm sure the participants really appreciated like the kind of care you took in including them in the research process and making sure they felt they were cared for. So I'm kind of wondering, what participant feedback did you get from everybody? Like, it seems like you established a good rapport with them, that you had a good relationship with a lot of the subjects. So I'm curious on like, how was it for them to receive those tokens of appreciation or like be involved in like a book where they talk about their lived experiences?
So we met personally with our participants 3 times. And what was so fascinating to me about this experience was that, first of all, I was so glad we decided to collect data in person because it's just a different thing. You have face-to-face interactions. Actually, every time we met them where they wanted us to. So we said, what's a convenient location for you? Some people said, meet me at the library, meet me at the uni, meet me at this cafe, meet me at my home. Then we had this like interesting range of experiences with our participants. People got to like just vibe, and then people wanted to see you again. For a lot of folks, especially the ones that were like maybe struggling more, like this was actually an opportunity to see people, to practice Dutch maybe. So we had like a team that was like Dutch speaking, Arabic speaking, and then like just English speaking as international students. So we would ask them like, who do you want to meet with after the first assessment? As a researcher from the outside, I was like, it's really important that the first assessment, they meet with somebody who's Syrian. And so we had Kenan and Zaina and Huda go and meet with folks. And then we started to get feedback where some people were like, oh, can we actually meet like a Dutch person or like an international person? Because like we want to practice or we want to see new people. And so that I had never thought about that. And like if we hadn't met in person, we wouldn't have gotten that type of feedback. And so other feedback that we got was that people were lacking services, that people would actually ask some of the data collection folks to like help with filling out forms and et cetera. And some people expressed like that was sometimes hard because it's like, as a person, you want to help people. What's the boundary between like doing those types of things where it's like, that's not a problem, but like also carrying that weight as well.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of really open conversations about that. And I think the other feedback that we got was that there was this type of data collection that's very intensive. It's called experience sampling. It's pretty intense because in general, like people do it for a few days or like up to 2 weeks, or some people have actually done it for like a year. Like some researchers have done it for a whole year, where you ask people to like download an app on their phone and then they're kind of pinged every so often to answer, hey, what are you doing? How are you feeling? We call it collecting data in the wild because the person doesn't need to be in a lab. They don't need to be near the computer, and everybody's like obsessed with their smartphone. So it's actually kind of nice way to like have a push notification show up and be like, how are you? And what we were surprised by, because like we thought maybe this is too intrusive, or not intrusive, but like annoying, right? Because you got to answer questions, is that some people got so used to it that they started to miss it. Like they were like, I want to tell you how I'm feeling. I want to have that time to reflect.
Yeah.
Obviously, there were people that like, this is like the most annoying thing ever. There's so much variability, but like we got feedback like that. And we got feedback that people really appreciated, like those small moments of contact. You know, another data collection method we use that sounds like on the face of it really invasive is called the electronically activated recorder. And this is basically like you can build it into like your experience sampling assessment that like for us, we did it within 2 days of the experience sampling study, where every 5.5 minutes or so, the phone would record with very high fidelity, like 30 seconds of their life. One of my colleagues that was a consultant on the project actually uses the ear, that's the electronically activated recorder for short, in her research on families and children. People were like, is this going to affect my status? Are you going to hand this over to any authorities? And we had never, you know what I mean? Like as naive researchers, we're like, oh, the ear is cool. And so we kind of thought about that, and we made everything optional. We made this stuff optional, but a small number of people, they were agreeable to this. And you know how I said like researchers at UTM have been unpacking that data? It's been really, really interesting because we hear people like listening to music that's traditionally played during breakfast. We hear people learning Dutch. We hear people on the train. We hear people living their life. I guess if you're like skeptical about self-reports, or you're like, maybe we need more sources of data, like this is a really cool way to kind of get a sense of how people are doing and functioning in their daily life.
You had such like a large team to consult throughout the process. And I'm sure when you have the sample that you had where they went through a really vulnerable time in their lives, and you also have all these like different methodologies that you were employing, like the ear, you want to make sure that you are being culturally sensitive, or you're being sensitive to the experiences that people have went through, or the experiences that they're currently going through. And you had this group called the Cultural Advisory Board that you kind of consulted throughout the process. And I think it was really unique to your study again. And I want to ask you, what was that board and what role did it play in your research?
Yeah, so the Cultural Advisory Board, it is part of the method of participatory action research. What it does is it allows you to consult with folks that have lived experience, or they have worked with like the population of interest, or they can help guide the study in some way. So like we had a psychiatrist, we had folks who were working with the populations of people with refugee backgrounds, with Syrian people. You know, ideally, if I had unlimited time and more foresight and lots of funding, the perfect study would be to like hang out in the community first and actually ask folks, do you think this study needs to be done?
Yeah.
And so we were catching up with this. We were like, this is really naive of us, but how do we pivot and make this as like I said, participant facing as possible? So the advisory board is just kind of making sure we want to ask this many questions. Like, does that even make sense? Do these questions make sense? Like, speaking of being naive, it's like, we're going to collect data from 300 people and we're going to go to these places called asylum seeker centers, and everyone's going to want to participate because they're going to have unlimited time. People that are in asylum seeker centers, like they need to like get immediate support. They're not going to go like tell me how they're feeling on their smartphone.
Right.
And it sounds so ridiculous, like as I'm saying it right now, but like, when you're designing a study and you're kind of used to a certain frame, which is very like the basic research side of me, like this is how I was trained as a grad student to kind of be like, what's the most efficient way to get data versus like, what's the most realistic way? The advisory board was so helpful because they were like, yeah, like, it's great that you guys have been trying to share your study details at the asylum seeker centers, but what about if we also go to social media? That might change the demographics because it's like who's on social media? Probably not the full range of folks that we were ideally seeking to reach, but we ended up doing that. We did some events too, and what's interesting is that we met a lot of resistance, and that totally makes sense to me. Like we would show up at events where people are supposed to be socializing, communing, and we're like, hello, I am a researcher. I think we had this like initial like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? Like turning point. And then we were very humble about it. We were like, oh my gosh, like, trying to not be obtrusive, but just like get to know folks. But like, how I said, ideally we'd spend time in the community. Like that's my biggest regret. If I could do it over again, I would just make sure that this kind of research was actually interesting and that the population of interest in the people that we wanted in our study would want that kind of research to happen, right? And I think at the end of the day, like because we were taking like this less of a narrow approach, I think a lot of people appreciated that. They were like, we're not just refugees. We're like people. We're like multidimensional. Like one of the things that we asked them was like, dude, we've been asking you a bunch of stuff about like your life and your history. Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to share? And we were so delighted by some of the stories. And one day, like I hope to like share those. But for example, one of our participants was like, hey, I fell in love. I met somebody that I really like, and I just wanted to share that like I love somebody, and like, so I don't know, that's so cool. Yeah. And like, that's stuff that you don't see unless you let them use their voice. Yeah. And so, we ended up doing that. A lot of that, we pivoted a lot towards the end of the study.
Yeah, so I think that cultural advisory board allowed you to be open, and I think that's what kind of allowed those voices to feel more free. And that kind of brings me to open science. For those that don't know, open science is a movement which seeks to make methodologies and scientific processes and outcomes more accessible and, as it says in the title, open to the public and to academic communities. And you mentioned in your papers that open science, or an open science perspective, was taken in your studies, and we talked about that a lot already, but I think it kind of informed a lot of the next steps you took in your methodology and how you talked with your participants. So can you talk more on that and like exactly how it influenced your research?
At least in personality psychology, there were a lot of people that were like very active, including somebody named Samin Vizier. And she actually was coming in as a faculty member as I was leaving my grad program to go to the Netherlands. And we talked a little bit, and she's actually helped shape like the way that I see science, because I am sometimes on the most depressing days, I'm like, I don't even know why we do research sometimes, because it's so incentive driven. Even with the Karakter Project, it turned out to be so wonderful, but there were some stupid decisions that we made in the beginning that were really driven by those incentives that are very hard to see unless you're outside of that cultural context, right? And so I've always wanted to make things better. Like, how can I, as like in my role, make our findings more transparent, more clear? How can we talk about them in a more like chill way? Because we're used to amplifying, or like not amplifying, but like maybe exaggerating how important our studies are. And I think dispositionally, or my personality is pretty well suited for being more chill. And so when I was going into the Karakter Project, I was like, oh, I'm so inspired by like the open science movement. But it's so hard to do with longitudinal research because a lot of it, at least our project, was exploratory. We didn't have like huge hypotheses or anything like that. We had a sense of what we wanted to investigate. But again, if that question is like, does adversity help you grow? I'm not going to place a hypothesis there. I'm just going to let it be open and then collect data on variables that I think are important for reflecting or helping to answer that question. So I think you've also heard that we pivoted so many times that like when you make multiple changes to stuff, there's no real way to pre-register something. And I've become quite skeptical about pre-registrations. I think they're really good, but I have yet to find a pre-registration that we stick to completely because stuff happens, right? And especially with a population like that of the Karakter Project, lots of things that we planned for didn't work out. But one way to still be an open scientist when it comes to this stuff is just to record it all. And what's cool about that is that if somebody is inspired to do similar work, they can learn from our mistakes. They can learn from what we found really helpful. They can get like this really open record, like almost a really boring record. Like I doubt like people have actually read everything, but like we were really meticulous about documenting changes because we were like, this is what happens. Sharing is caring, It's like, That's why I really like open science too. It's like being transparent. It takes the onus off of you too as like a researcher to be by yourself. You can get feedback from others if they know what your study protocol is. You can get people to extend your work. That's like so awesome. And I've shared my materials and we have our materials up and people have told me like, hey, I really appreciated that you shared your code book or whatever because like I had this idea and like, oh, that helps me be more kind to our research team about, oh, what if this doesn't work out, In terms of open science, like I'm like, there are still ways that you can do things. Like you can still pre-register all your stuff because that's kind of like a research log. This is how we planned things and this is how it actually worked out. So it's really nice to document that. You can share all your materials, like I was saying. You could share the scripts that you use to analyze your data. You could share like your cool participant enrichment activities so people can also be like, hey, I could do that, right?
Yeah.
So there's so many good things about it. That was sort of the open science practices that we tended to use for that study.
Yeah, so there's like such a wealth of knowledge to take away from the project. And I know the project is still ongoing, so this might be kind of a weird question to ask, but what lessons or like messages do you want the public and maybe like fellow people in academia to take away from the project?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to keep it brief, but I feel like the first lesson is that reflexivity is really important if you want to work on projects where people who are not usually represented in psych, in the psychological literature. If you want to include folks that are underrepresented, historically excluded from minoritized groups, you need to first ask yourself that question, why do I want to do this project? I wish that we had done that more. It was like Zaina, Huda, Keenan, Rima. Those are the folks that like made the project awesome. And, there are other team members that like were amazing as well. But I feel like it's really our Syrian team members that like turned the project around and just being open to being flexible, expecting almost that there's always going to be something that you didn't prepare for. That's okay. To try to use as many open science practices as possible, even if like some don't apply, right? Making it a habit to record things that happened, why you did those things. And then also like really focusing on participant enrichment. And I know this is all related, right? Because it's like, why am I doing this research? I think anyone who cares about psychological research might be like, it's to help people broadly. But when it comes to people that are, again, underrepresented in the psychological literature, you have to be very intentional. So being participant facing, asking folks what they think, partnering with them would be ideal. So in our case, we had written the grant proposal already, and we didn't partner until we started looking for personnel. But ideally, we would have included folks in the grant writing process, right? We would have hung out with them and asked them, what do you think we should study? So those kinds of things. And I think the theme behind that's really hard for a lot of people that are doing psych research, is that takes a lot of time. And a lot of that work is like seen as kind of like, I call it vibing, but I feel like it's such an important part of the work, but that's very hard to quantify, right?
Right.
So, but it's still like, I think like if people are motivated, it's such an amazing experience. It'll force you to challenge your assumptions about how should research be done and maybe change your trajectory. And that's really cool.
Thank you for that. So the data behind Karakter is still being analyzed, and there's a lot of resources online that I found where you could learn more about it. Let the audience know, where can you learn more about Karakter and keep updated with everything that's going on? Yeah,
so we do have a project website, and we are trying to update it as we start to publish more on that project. So it's karakterproject.nl. So Karakter project.nl.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come here. I know it's a busy time during the semester, but I appreciate you coming here and helping me communicate your research because it's really great. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Andre.
Yeah, for sure. When Dr. Chung and her team enriched the research process, they made the data collection experience more enjoyable and beneficial for their participants. This enrichment entailed newsletters, gift baskets, special events, psychology seminars, and a book compiling participants' art. It also included the regular consultation of a cultural advisory board, a team of psychology experts who ensured cultural sensitivity throughout the study. The research team's concern for the comfort and well-being of their subjects was generally received well, leading to an increased sense of trust and belonging. We identified open science principles as critical when creating, running, and analyzing psychological studies. Dr. Chung recommends documenting any changes and developments in the study process to researchers aiming to adopt a more open approach in their work. Continuous reflection, participant enrichment, and the integration of open science ideas are central to the Karakter Project. Reflexivity enabled Dr. Chung and her colleagues to identify opportunities to enhance their study and to build better rapport with their participants. By giving precedence to the experiences of their subjects, the researchers created an environment conducive to open feedback and dialogue. The use of open science principles provided a wealth of resources that researchers can consult if they are curious about how the study developed or if they wish to replicate it. Prioritizing these practices can help improve not only the experiences of psychological study subjects, but also the quality of research findings. Thank you for listening. The data collected from the Karakter Project is still being analyzed. If you would like to keep track with updates, visit karakterproject.nl. That is Karakter project.nl.